The fluorescent lights in the police station buzzed overhead like angry wasps, casting harsh shadows across my face as I sat in that cold metal chair. My hands wouldn't stop shaking as I stared at the manila envelope Detective Santos had placed in front of me just moments before. The paper felt rough against my fingertips, and I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. "Mrs. Morrison," Detective Santos said gently, her voice cutting through the fog in my mind. "I know this is difficult, but you need to see what's inside." I thought I knew my husband of 28 years. I thought I knew every line on David's face, every habit, every dream he'd ever shared with me over morning coffee. I thought those 2 days he disappeared without a word of my life. 2 days of calling hospitals, filing missing person reports, imagining him lying hurt somewhere, needing me. I was wrong. My fingers trembled as I lifted the envelope's metal clasp. The sound it made seemed to echo in the small room, final and unforgiving. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, that would shatter everything I believed about the man I'd shared a bed with for nearly 3 decades. David's face smiled back at me from the first photo. But he wasn't smiling at me. He was looking at another woman, a woman I'd never seen before, with the same expression he used to give me when we were newlyweds. His hand was on her rounded belly, protective and tender, the way he'd touched me when I was pregnant with our children. The detective's voice seemed to come from far away. "The photographs were taken over the past 8 months, Mrs. Morrison. The woman's name is Sarah Chin. She's 29 years old. 29, the same age I was when David and I bought our first house together. When we planted the oak tree in our backyard that now towered over our roof. The same age I was when I thought our future was infinite and bright. Those 2 days your husband was missing," Detective Santos continued. "He wasn't in danger. He was with her finalizing the paperwork for the divorce he'd been planning behind your back." The words hit me like physical blows. Divorce papers, secret bank accounts, a whole life he'd been building without me, while I worried about whether he was eating enough, whether his back was bothering him from his long days at work, whether he needed me to pick up his dry cleaning. When he came home and told me, "You'll understand soon." The detective's voice was soft now, almost apologetic. He was referring to the divorce papers his attorney was preparing to serve you. He wanted to watch you worry for those 2 days while he was planning to leave you for another woman. The cruelty of it took my breath away. Not just the affair, not just the lies, but the calculated coldness of making me suffer while he orchestrated my abandonment. The man who had held me while I cried over my mother's death, who had celebrated every small victory in our children's lives, who had promised to love me in sickness and in health. That man had watched me fall apart while he planned his escape. I set the photographs down with steady hands, though my heart was breaking in real time. "How long have you known?" I asked, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. "We've been investigating for 3 weeks," Detective Santos replied. "The bank contacted us about suspicious activity in your joint accounts." 3 weeks? While I'd been making his favorite meals, while I'd been planning our anniversary dinner, while I'd been living in our house like everything was normal, the police had been unraveling the lie that was my marriage. Before we start, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. That envelope changed everything. It destroyed the woman I was, but it also set her free. Before that envelope shattered my world, I lived in what I thought was a beautiful love story. Our life together had a rhythm, a comfortable dance we'd perfected over 28 years of marriage. Every morning at 6:15, I'd wake up 5 minutes before David's alarm, slipping quietly out of bed to start his coffee. French roast, 2 sugars, just a splash of cream. I'd learned exactly how he liked it during our first year of marriage, and I never stopped caring about getting it right. By the time he stumbled into the kitchen, hair still messy from sleep, his coffee would be waiting in his favorite mug, the one Emma had painted for him in 3rd grade with "World's Best Dad" written in crooked purple letters. He'd take that first sip, close his eyes, and sigh contentedly. "What would I do without you, Claire?" he'd say, and I'd feel that warm glow of being needed, of being loved. I'd pack his lunch while he showered, always including little notes on napkins. "Hope your day is wonderful." Or, don't forget we're having dinner with the Johnsons tonight. Sometimes I'd draw little hearts or smiley faces. David would find them around noon and text me, "Your note made my whole office jealous. I'm the luckiest man alive." Our house was my pride and joy, a colonial with blue shutters that I'd spend hours maintaining. Every room told the story of our family. The living room walls were covered with framed photographs. David and me at our wedding, young and glowing. Emma in her high school graduation cap. Tyler hitting his first home run in Little League. All of us at Disney World, sunburned and laughing. The mantel held our collection of anniversary gifts to each other, a small crystal vase from year 5, a wooden sculpture from our trip to Vermont, and a silver picture frame from our 20th anniversary. Sunday dinners were sacred in our house. I'd spend the entire morning preparing David's favorite pot roast with carrots and potatoes, the recipe I'd learned from his mother. The smell would fill the house, warm and inviting. When the kids were home from college, we'd all gather around the dining room table, and David would carve the roast with the same ceremony every time. "Nobody makes it like your mother," he'd tell Emma and Tyler, and I'd beam with pride. The neighbors often commented on us. "You two are relationship goals," Janet from next door would say when she'd see us working in the garden together on Saturday mornings. David would plant while I weeded, and we'd plan our flower beds for the season. Mrs. Peterson from across the street would shake her head admiringly. 28 years, and you still look at each other like newlyweds. And it felt true. When David would come home from work, he'd find me in whatever room I was in and kiss my forehead. Always my forehead, soft and lingering. It was our thing, our little ritual of reconnection after being apart all day. "How was your day, beautiful?" he'd ask, and I'd tell him about the library, about the children I'd helped find books, about the small dramas of my quiet world. Evenings were ours. We'd sit on the porch swing he'd built for our 15th anniversary, watching the sunset paint our street in golden light. David would tell me about his insurance cases, and I'd listen, asking questions, offering support. We'd plan weekend trips, discuss Emma's job search, and worry together about Tyler's grades. We were a team, a unit, facing life together. I lived for those small moments of connection. The way he'd reach for my hand during movies, how he'd hum while doing dishes, and the way he'd still open car doors for me after all these years. I thought we were building something beautiful together, something that would last forever. I had no idea I was the only one building it. The first crack in my perfect world appeared on a rainy Tuesday in March, 3 months before David's disappearance. It was such a small thing, really, the kind of detail that could easily be explained away, forgotten, dismissed. But looking back now, I realized that crack was the beginning of everything falling apart. David had been coming home later than usual for about 2 weeks. Nothing dramatic, maybe an hour, sometimes 2. When I'd ask about it over dinner, he'd rub his temples and sigh heavily. "The workload at the office is insane right now. Claire Johnson's been pushing everyone to take on extra cases. You know how it is with insurance adjusters. When there's a big storm or accident cluster, we all have to pull overtime." I believe him completely. Why wouldn't I? In 28 years of marriage, David had never lied to me about anything more serious than secretly eating the last piece of my homemade apple pie. He'd always been honest, reliable, the kind of man who called if he was going to be even 15 minutes late. But that Tuesday, something made me pick up the phone. Maybe it was the way he'd seemed distracted during breakfast, checking his phone more than usual. Maybe it was how he'd forgotten to take his lunch, the first time in years. Or maybe it was just a wife's intuition, that subtle internal alarm that sounds when something feels off. I called his office around 6:30, planning to ask if he wanted me to keep his dinner warm. The phone rang twice before Mike Brennan, David's colleague and our occasional barbecue guest, picked up. "Morrison Insurance, this is Mike." "Hi, Mike. It's Claire Morrison. Is David still there? I wanted to check if he'd be home soon for dinner." There was a pause. Not long, maybe 3 seconds, but in that silence, I felt my stomach drop. "David, Claire." David left at 5:30, like always. Actually, he seemed pretty eager to get out of here today. Said he was heading straight home to his beautiful wife. The words hit me like ice water. David left at 5:30. It was now 6:30, and he wasn't home. Our house was a 20-minute drive from his office, even in heavy traffic. Where had he been for the past hour? Oh, I managed, trying to keep my voice light. He must have stopped somewhere. Thanks, Mike. No problem. Tell him I said hi. We missed him at the office happy hour last Friday, by the way. Haven't seen him at one of those in months. Happy hour. David had told me he'd been working late last Friday. Another lie. Another crack in the foundation of our life together. When David walked through the door at 7:15, I was waiting in the kitchen, stirring a pot of soup that didn't need stirring. He looked normal, tired but normal. His tie was loose, his hair slightly mussed, but nothing that screamed deception. Sorry I'm late, honey, he said, kissing my forehead in that familiar way. Traffic was murder tonight. I called the office, I said quietly, watching his face. Mike said, you left at 5:30. For just a moment, maybe a second, David's expression changed. His eyes widened slightly, and I saw something I'd never seen before. Calculation.
He was deciding what to tell me.
Then he laughed, that easy, familiar laugh that had charmed me for decades.
Mike. Claire.
Mike's been hitting the bottle pretty hard lately. Haven't you noticed? He gets confused about everything. Yesterday, he thought it was Thursday when it was clearly Wednesday. I'm worried about him, actually. He pulled me into a hug, and I breathed in his familiar scent. Aftershave and coffee and something else I couldn't identify, something that didn't belong. You worry too much, he whispered into my hair. You know I'd never lie to you. I wanted to believe him. I chose to believe him. That choice would haunt me for months to come. After that first lie about Mike, something shifted in our house. It was subtle at first, like a photograph slowly fading in sunlight. You don't notice it happening until one day you realize the colors have completely changed. David was still there, still going through the motions of being my husband, but piece by piece, I was becoming invisible to him. It started with the small conversations. For years, David had been my most interested audience. When I'd share stories from the library, I'd tell him about Mrs. Chun, the elderly woman who came in every Tuesday to read romance novels, or about little Tommy Martinez, who'd finally conquered his fear of chapter books. David used to laugh at my impressions of the different characters in my daily life, ask follow-up questions, remember details from previous stories. But suddenly, when I'd start talking, I'd notice his eyes glazing over. He'd nod at appropriate moments, make sounds, but I could tell he wasn't really listening. One evening, I tested him. I was telling him about a particularly challenging patron who'd been rude to our newest volunteer. And mid-sentence, I switched topics completely. And then she told me that elephants had taken over the children's section and were teaching story time. I said, watching his face carefully. That's nice, honey, David replied, not looking up from his phone. Sounds like you handled it well. My heart sank. He hadn't heard a word I'd said. The erosion spread to our family connections, too. Emma started calling less frequently because whenever she video chatted with us, David would find excuses to leave the room. Tell Emma I said hi, he'd say, already walking away. I need to check on something in the garage. Or, I should return this work call. Always something more important than talking to our daughter. During Tyler's last call from college, when he was excitedly telling us about making the dean's list, David sat at the kitchen table with us, but spent the entire conversation checking emails on his phone. When Tyler asked directly, Dad, did you hear what I said about my history professor? David looked up blankly.
Sorry, son.
Work's been crazy. What did you say? The hurt in Tyler's voice was unmistakable. Never mind, Dad. It wasn't important. But it was important. Everything our children shared with us was important. And David used to know that. He used to be the father who remembered every test, every game, every small triumph and disappointment in their lives. The worst part was how he started treating my needs like burdens. When I suggested we take a weekend trip to the bed and breakfast where we'd honeymooned, something we'd done every few years to reconnect, David's response was sharp and dismissive. Claire, can't you see I'm stressed about work? Not everything is about your need for attention. Some of us have real responsibilities. The words hit me like a slap. My need for attention. In 28 years of marriage, I'd never been demanding. I'd never been the wife who nagged or complained or asked for more than he was willing to give. I'd built my life around supporting his dreams, his needs, his schedule. That night, I lay in bed next to him, listening to him breathe, and felt more alone than I had since before we met. When had I become a burden to him? When had my love become something he had to endure rather than something he cherished? I started questioning everything. Was I too needy? Was I asking for too much when I wanted to share my day with him? Was I being selfish when I hoped he'd show interest in our children's lives? Was I the problem? I began editing myself, sharing less, asking for less, trying to take up less space in his life. I thought if I could just be easier to love, maybe he'd love me again the way he used to. I was slowly erasing myself, and I didn't even realize it was happening. The moment that broke something fundamental inside me happened at the Hendersons' 25th anniversary party in May. It was one of those warm spring evenings that made everything feel possible, and I'd been looking forward to the celebration for weeks. Social gatherings had become rare for David and me lately. He always seemed to have an excuse to avoid them, but he'd agreed to this one because Bill Henderson was an important client. I'd chosen my outfit carefully that day, a navy blue dress that David had once said brought out my eyes, paired with the pearl necklace he'd given me for our 20th anniversary. I'd even gotten my hair done that afternoon, splurging on highlights for the first time in months. When I'd shown David, hoping for a compliment, he'd barely looked up from his phone. "You look fine, Claire," he'd said absently. "Are you ready to go?"
Fine.
Not beautiful, not lovely, just fine. The party was in the Hendersons' backyard, strung with fairy lights and filled with the warm buzz of conversation and laughter. I knew most of the couples there. Neighbors, coworkers, friends we'd shared barbecues and dinner parties with over the years. These were people who knew us, who had watched our marriage evolve from young love to what I thought was a mature partnership. I was coming back from the kitchen, where I'd been helping Linda Henderson arrange desserts, when I heard David's voice carrying across the patio. He was standing near the fire pit with 3 other husbands, beer in hand, and they were having one of those conversations that men seem to fall into naturally, half joking, half serious, the kind where they reveal more than they probably intend to. "Marriage is like a comfortable prison after a while," David was saying, his voice louder than usual. "You just go through the motions. Same routine, same conversations, same everything. Sometimes I feel like I'm suffocating." The other men laughed, but it was uncomfortable laughter. Bill Henderson shifted awkwardly. "Come on, David. You and Claire seem happy enough." "Happy." David took a long sip of his beer. "I guess, but happiness isn't the same as being alive. You know, sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd made different choices." My feet had stopped moving. I was standing behind a group of women, close enough to hear every word, but hidden from David's view. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure everyone could hear it. "Different choices?" prompted Jim Walsh, our next-door neighbor. "Different woman," David said simply. "Someone who doesn't need constant reassurance. Someone who has her own life, her own interests. Someone who doesn't make me feel guilty for wanting 5 minutes of peace when I get home from work." I felt like I was watching my marriage dissected in public. Every private moment of disconnect laid bare for our friends' entertainment. But the worst was yet to come. Gathering what remained of my composure, I walked over to the group, forcing a smile onto my face. "What are you gentlemen talking about?" I asked, trying to sound light and casual. The conversation stopped abruptly. The other men looked embarrassed, suddenly finding their shoes very interesting. But David looked right through me as if I were made of glass. "Oh, just work stuff," he said dismissively. Then, without missing a beat, he turned to me with that patronizing smile I was starting to recognize. "Honey, why don't you go help the ladies in the kitchen? I'm sure they could use another pair of hands." The dismissal was swift and brutal. In front of our friends, our neighbors, people who had known us for years, David had reduced me to nothing more than a helpful kitchen assistant. Not his wife, not his partner, not even worthy of being included in adult conversation, just someone to be managed and directed. "Of course," I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. I turned and walked away, my cheeks burning with shame. Behind me, I heard the conversation resume, but I couldn't make out the words over the roaring in my ears. In the Henderson's powder room, I stared at myself in the mirror and saw a stranger looking back. A woman who had become so small, so insignificant that even her own husband couldn't see her anymore. The morning David disappeared started like any other morning in our slowly crumbling marriage. My alarm went off at 6:15, and I slipped out of bed to start his coffee, moving through our kitchen in the gray pre-dawn light like a ghost going through familiar motions. French roast, 2 sugars, splash of cream. The routine was so automatic, I could have done it in my sleep. David shuffled into the kitchen at 6:45, hair still tousled, wearing the blue striped pajama pants I'd bought him last Christmas. He took his first sip of coffee and closed his eyes with that familiar, satisfied sigh. For a moment, he looked like the man I'd fallen in love with 30 years ago. "Perfect as always," he said, leaning over to kiss my forehead. The gesture felt so normal, so loving, that for a second, I forgot about the emotional distance that had been growing between us for months. "What would I do without you, Claire?" I smiled, holding on to that moment of tenderness like a lifeline. "Probably starve," I teased, sliding his lunch across the counter. Ham and Swiss on wheat bread, an apple, and a small bag of the pretzels he liked. I'd even included one of my little notes. "Hope your day is wonderful." "I love you," he said, grabbing his keys from the hook by the door. The words sounded genuine, natural, like they had for thousands of mornings before. "I love you, too," I replied, meaning it completely. That was the last, normal moment we would ever share. David didn't come home that night. By 7 o'clock, I was checking my phone every few minutes. By 8, I was calling his office only to reach voicemail. By 9, I was pacing our living room, alternating between anger and worry. Had he forgotten to call? Was he working late again? Was he avoiding me after another day of treating me like I was invisible? But by 10 o'clock, worry had completely overtaken anger. David might have been emotionally distant lately, but he'd never just disappeared. Even during our worst periods, he'd always called, always let me know where he was. I spent that first night in our living room chair, fully dressed, jumping at every sound that might be his car in the driveway. I called his phone dozens of times, each call going straight to voicemail. "Hi, you've reached David Morrison. Please leave a message and I'll get back to you." That cheerful, professional voice mocked me through the sleepless hours. The second day was worse. I called his office again and spoke to Mike Brennan, who sounded genuinely confused. "Claire," David said, he was taking a couple personal days. "I assumed you knew." He seemed, I don't know, excited about something. Said he had important business to take care of. Personal days, important business. David hadn't mentioned anything to me. We'd been sharing a life for 28 years. What important business could he have that I wouldn't know about? By noon on the second day, I was at the police station filling out missing person paperwork with shaking hands. The officer, a young woman with kind eyes, asked questions that made my situation feel even more surreal. When did I last see him? Was he depressed? Had we been fighting? Did he have access to large amounts of money? "Ma'am," she said gently, "in cases like this, when there's no sign of foul play, adults sometimes they leave voluntarily. Is there any chance your husband might be staying somewhere else by choice?" The suggestion hit me like a physical blow. David might have chosen to leave me, chosen to let me worry and panic while he was somewhere else, somewhere safe, somewhere that wasn't with me. That night, I sat in our bed, surrounded by the life we'd built together, family photos on the nightstand, his reading glasses on his pillow, the book he'd been reading bookmarked on page 43, and felt more abandoned than I'd ever felt in my life. Then, on the third day, I heard his key in the front door. The sound of David's key turning in the front door at 2:30 on that third afternoon made my heart stop. I'd been sitting at our kitchen table, staring at my untouched cup of coffee, when I heard the familiar jingle of his keychain, the one with the little leather fob Emma had made him in middle school shop class. For a split second, relief flooded through me so completely that I nearly collapsed. He was alive. He was home. Whatever had happened, whatever had kept him away, It was over now. I rushed to the front hallway, my socks slipping on the hardwood floor in my haste to reach him. There he stood, looking completely normal. Same khaki pants, same navy polo shirt he'd been wearing when he left for work 3 days ago. Though now they were wrinkled and carried an unfamiliar scent, something floral and sweet that definitely wasn't his usual cologne. "David," I cried, throwing my arms around him, pressing my face against his chest. "Oh my God, where were you?" I was so scared. I thought something terrible had happened. I filed a police report. I called hospitals. But his response wasn't what I expected. Instead of the apologetic explanations, the reassurances, the guilt over making me worry, David simply hugged me back with an odd, almost mechanical precision. When I pulled back to look at his face, searching for answers, for some explanation that would make sense of the past 3 days of hell, I saw something that chilled me to the bone. He was smiling. Not the relieved smile of a man grateful to be home safe. Not the sheepish smile of someone who knew they'd caused unnecessary worry. This was something else entirely. A smile that seemed to come from some private joke, some secret knowledge that I wasn't part of. His eyes held a brightness I hadn't seen in months, but it wasn't directed at me. It was as if he were looking through me at something wonderful, just over my shoulder. "Where were you?" I repeated, my voice smaller now, less certain. "David, I was terrified. I thought you were dead." He placed his hands on my shoulders, still wearing that strange, distant smile. "Claire," he said softly, his voice carrying an odd note of, what was it? Anticipation? Excitement. "You'll understand soon." "Understand what?" "David, what are you talking about? Where have you been for 3 days?" "Everything's going to make sense soon," he continued as if I hadn't spoken. His hands moved to cup my face, a gesture that should have been tender, but felt somehow clinical. "I promise you, Claire, very soon everything will be crystal clear." There was something in his voice, something in the way he was looking at me that made my blood run cold. This wasn't the man who had kissed my forehead and told me he loved me 3 mornings ago. This was someone wearing David's face, speaking with David's voice. But the warmth, the connection, the 28 years of shared history, it was all gone, replaced by this terrible, knowing smile. "David, you're scaring me," I whispered. "Please, just tell me where you were. Tell me what's happening." He kissed my forehead then, the same gesture he'd performed thousands of times before. But now it felt like a benediction, like a goodbye. "I need to shower," he said, releasing me and heading toward our bedroom. "We'll talk later." But we didn't talk later. David spent the rest of that day humming to himself, checking his phone constantly, moving through our house like a man with a wonderful secret he was dying to share, but not quite ready to reveal. Every time I tried to bring up his disappearance, he'd give me that same mysterious smile and say, "Soon, Claire. Very soon." I went to bed that night lying next to a stranger who looked exactly like my husband. The week after David's return felt like living in a psychological thriller where I was the only one who didn't know the plot. Every morning I'd wake up hoping the previous day had been a nightmare. That I'd find my real husband beside me. The one who worried when I worried. Who explained when I was confused. Who didn't smile secret smiles that excluded me from my own life. But instead, I woke up next to the stranger who wore David's face and hummed while he brushed his teeth. The humming was the worst part. David had never been a hummer. In 28 years of marriage, the most musical he'd ever gotten was singing Happy Birthday to the kids. And even then, he'd been slightly off-key and self-conscious about it. But now, he hummed constantly while making coffee, while reading the newspaper, while getting dressed for work. Little melodies I didn't recognize, cheerful and light, as if he discovered some wonderful secret that made everything in the world suddenly beautiful. Everything except me. I couldn't eat. Food tasted like cardboard and my stomach stayed knotted in a constant state of anxiety. I'd sit across from him at breakfast, watching him butter his toast with unusual care, humming that mysterious tune, and feel like I was disappearing right there at our own kitchen table. When I'd try to start conversations, asking about his work, mentioning something I'd heard on the news, even commenting on the weather, he'd respond with distracted politeness, as if I were an acquaintance making small talk rather than his wife of nearly 3 decades. The Andersons' dog got out again yesterday, I said one morning, desperate for any kind of normal interaction. I helped them look for about an hour before we found him hiding under the Petersons' deck. "That's nice of you, honey," David replied, not looking up from his phone. "That's nice of you," as if I were a helpful neighbor, not the woman who'd shared his bed, raised his children, built a life with him brick by brick over almost 30 years. Sleep became impossible. I'd lie in our bed at 3 o'clock in the morning, listening to David breathe peacefully beside me, and wonder if I was losing my mind. The man next to me felt like a stranger, wearing my husband's skin. He looked the same, sounded the same, even smelled mostly the same, except for that lingering floral scent I couldn't identify, something that seemed to cling to his clothes no matter how many times I washed them. I started standing in our bedroom doorway in the middle of the night, just watching him sleep. His face in the moonlight looked so familiar, so beloved. But when he was awake, when those eyes opened and looked at me with polite disinterest, I felt like I was drowning in my own home. The house itself seemed to echo differently now. Rooms that had once felt warm and lived in now felt hollow, like a museum of someone else's life. I'd walk through the hallways, past the family photos that lined the walls, and feel like I was looking at pictures of strangers. Who was that laughing woman at Emma's graduation? Who was that couple dancing at their friend's wedding last year? Those people looked happy, connected, real. I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt real. My reflection in the bathroom mirror became foreign to me. My hair looked limp, my eyes were shadowed with sleepless nights, and my skin had taken on a grayish pallor that no amount of concealer could hide. I looked like what I was becoming, a ghost in my own life. The worst moments came when David's phone would buzz with text messages. His face would light up in a way it hadn't for me in months, maybe years. He'd read whatever message had arrived, and that secret smile would spread across his features again. Then he'd glance at me, sitting right there beside him, and the smile would fade into polite indifference. I was living with a man who was falling in love, and it wasn't with me. The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was reorganizing the spice cabinet, a mindless task I'd been using to fill the hours since sleep had become impossible. When the phone rang at 9:47 a.m., I assumed it was Janet calling to check on me, or maybe Emma trying to reach me between classes. The last thing I expected was to hear an unfamiliar woman's voice saying words that would turn my world completely upside down. "Mrs. Morrison, this is Detective Maria Santos with the County Police Department. We need you to come to the station. It's about your husband." The spice jar I'd been holding, oregano, the one I'd bought just last week, slipped from my fingers and shattered on the kitchen floor. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence that followed her words. Is David hurt?" My voice came out as barely a whisper. After days of feeling like I was losing my mind, my first thought was that something terrible had finally happened to explain his strange behavior. Maybe he'd been in an accident during those missing 2 days. Maybe he had a brain injury that explained why he'd become this smiling stranger. "No, ma'am, he's not hurt, but we do need to speak with you as soon as possible. Can you come in this morning?" The drive to the police station passed in a blur. I kept thinking about the last thing David had said to me that morning as he left for work. "Have a good day, Claire." Not "I love you." Not even "see you tonight." Just the kind of thing you'd say to a casual acquaintance. I'd watched him walk to his car, noting how he seemed to have a spring in his step that hadn't been there in years. Detective Santos was a woman about my age with kind eyes and prematurely gray hair that she wore pulled back in a practical ponytail. She led me to a small room with beige walls and fluorescent lighting that made everything look harsh and unforgiving. On the table sat a manila envelope, thick and ominous. "Mrs. Morrison," she began, her voice gentle but professional. "I know this is going to be difficult. We've been investigating some irregularities in your joint bank accounts. The bank contacted us 3 weeks ago about suspicious activity. 3 weeks while I'd been making David's favorite meals, while I'd been worrying about his distance, while I'd been questioning my own sanity, the police had been unraveling the truth about my marriage." "What kind of irregularities?" I asked, though part of me already knew I didn't want to hear the answer. Detective Santos opened the envelope and slid out a stack of photographs. The first one showed David, but not David as I knew him. This David was laughing, his arm around a woman I'd never seen, a petite Asian woman with long black hair and a radiant smile. They were sitting at an outdoor cafe, and David was looking at her the way he used to look at me 28 years ago. The woman's name is Sarah Chun, Detective Santos said quietly. She's 29 years old, works as a dental hygienist. These photographs were taken over the past 8 months. 8 months. I stared at the images. David and Sarah at restaurants. David and Sarah walking hand in hand through a park I didn't recognize. David and Sarah kissing in what appeared to be the doorway of an apartment building. In every photo, David looked happier than I'd seen him in years. Then Detective Santos showed me the bank statements, a secret account I'd never known existed, opened 10 months ago, regular deposits from our joint checking account, money I'd assumed was going to savings or investments, payments to jewelry stores, expensive restaurants, a travel agency. And this, she said, sliding another document across the table, is what we found in the apartment he's been renting for her. It was a lease agreement. David Morrison and Sarah Chun listed as co-tenants on a one-bedroom apartment across town. The lease had been signed 6 months ago, while I was at home planning our anniversary dinner. But the final piece of evidence was what destroyed me completely. Ultrasound photos. Sarah Chun was pregnant. I sat in my car outside the police station for 47 minutes, staring at the manila envelope in my lap, without moving. The parking lot buzzed with normal life around me. People coming and going, dealing with mundane problems like parking tickets and fender benders. Meanwhile, I held evidence that my entire adult life had been a carefully constructed lie. The strangest part was that I wasn't crying. I kept waiting for the tears to come, for the emotional breakdown that should follow learning your husband of 28 years has been living a double life. But instead, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: absolute crystalline clarity. Every confusing piece of the past year suddenly clicked into place like a puzzle solving itself. David's late nights that Mike had contradicted. His emotional distance, his distraction during family calls, his dismissive treatment of me at the Hendersons' party, the mysterious humming, the secret smiles, the way he'd been checking his phone constantly, even that floral scent on his clothes that I couldn't identify. It was her perfume. Sarah's perfume clinging to him after their secret meetings. "You'll understand soon," he told me when he returned from those 2 missing days. Now I did understand. Those weren't missing days at all. They were planning days. While I was filing police reports and calling hospitals, David had been with Sarah finalizing the details of how he would destroy my life. The apartment lease, the secret bank account, probably even divorce papers that I hadn't seen yet. The cruelty of it took my breath away, but not in the devastating way I expected. Instead, it burned through me like rocket fuel, clearing away months of self-doubt and confusion. I'd been questioning my own sanity, wondering if I was being too needy, too demanding, too much trouble for him to love. I'd been editing myself, making myself smaller, trying to become worthy of scraps of attention from a man who was giving his whole heart to someone else. But I wasn't crazy. I wasn't imagining the distance, the coldness, the way he'd been treating me like an inconvenience in my own home. David had been pulling away because he was already gone emotionally and practically. He'd been living in 2 worlds, the one where he was a devoted husband and father, and the one where he was a man starting fresh with a young woman who was carrying his child. I thought about that morning just hours ago when he'd kissed my forehead and told me to have a good day. How many mornings had he performed that ritual while planning to leave me? How many times had he said, "I love you," while transferring money to his secret account? How many family dinners had he sat through while texting another woman under the table? The man I'd been mourning for months, the loving husband who seemed to have disappeared, that man was a fiction. He'd never existed. Or if he had, he'd been gone for far longer than I'd realized. I'd been grieving a ghost while the real David was building a new life that didn't include me. But here's what David hadn't counted on. I was still here, battered, confused, emotionally exhausted, but still here. And for the first time in months, I felt like myself again. Not the desperate woman trying to win back her husband's attention. Not the confused wife wondering what she'd done wrong. But Claire Morrison, the woman who had built a life, raised children, and survived challenges long before David Morrison entered the picture. I started the car and drove home to the house where David would be returning from work in a few hours, still wearing that secret smile, still humming his mysterious songs, still pretending to be my husband while he planned my abandonment. But now I knew something he didn't know I knew, and that knowledge was power. The woman David was about to divorce had just woken up. That night, I cooked David's favorite dinner, pot roast with carrots and potatoes, the recipe I'd learned from his mother 30 years ago. I set the table with our good china, lit candles, and opened a bottle of the wine we'd been saving for a special occasion. When David walked through the door at 6:15, he found me humming while I arranged flowers in a vase, the first time I'd hummed in months. "This looks wonderful, Claire," he said, and I could hear genuine surprise in his voice. "What's the occasion?" "No occasion," I replied, meeting his eyes with a smile that felt foreign on my face. "I just thought we should have a nice evening together." During dinner, I asked about his day, listened to his answers with apparent interest, and shared stories about mine. I was the perfect wife, attentive and loving, while inside, I felt like an actress playing a role I'd mastered over decades. David relaxed as the evening progressed, and I could see him wondering if maybe I was finally getting over whatever had been bothering me lately. If only he knew. The next morning, I waited until David left for work before calling in sick to the library. Instead of reorganizing spice cabinets or staring at family photos, I had work to do. Real work. I started with our home office, photographing every important document I could find with my phone: tax returns, insurance policies, bank statements, investment accounts. I took pictures of David's computer screen while it was open, capturing email addresses and financial information. I discovered things I'd never paid attention to before, things he had always handled because he was better with numbers. We had more assets than I'd realized, including investments I didn't even know existed. I also found gaps, accounts that were referenced in old tax documents, but not in current statements. Money that should have been there, but wasn't. That afternoon, I opened my own checking account at a different bank across town. Just a small amount to start, $500 from my library paychecks that I'd been depositing into our joint account for years. The young teller, probably Tyler's age, smiled as she handed me my temporary debit card. "Starting fresh?" she asked cheerfully. "Something like that," I replied. I found a divorce attorney through careful online research during my lunch breaks over the next few days. Sandra Martinez had excellent reviews and specialized in complex financial cases involving hidden assets. Her office was in the professional district downtown, far from anywhere David might accidentally see me. "Mrs. Morrison," she said during our consultation, "based on what you've told me, I suspect there are financial irregularities your husband hopes you'll never discover. We need to move carefully, but quickly." Sandra explained how to document everything, how to protect myself financially, and how to gather evidence without alerting David to what I was doing. She gave me a checklist of information to collect and warned me about common mistakes women make when they discover their husbands are planning to leave. "The biggest error is confronting them too soon," she said. "Right now, you have the advantage of knowing something he doesn't think you know. Don't give that up until you're ready to use it." At home, I became a different version of myself. I was more attentive to David, more interested in his stories, more affectionate. I stopped asking where he'd been or why he was late. I stopped mentioning his distant behavior or his mysterious phone calls. Instead, I became the wife he'd apparently been wanting me to be all along: undemanding, uncomplicated, easy. David began to relax around me in a way he hadn't in months. He even started staying home some evenings instead of working late, seeming to enjoy this new, improved version of his wife. During one of our pleasant dinners, he actually reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "I feel like I have my Claire back," he said softly. "You do," I assured him, squeezing back. "You absolutely do. I just wasn't the same Claire anymore." By the third week of my careful charade, something interesting started happening. David, who had been so confident and secretive for months, began showing signs of stress that he couldn't quite hide. It started small: a tightness around his eyes when his phone buzzed, a slight hesitation before answering certain calls, the way he'd unconsciously clench his jaw when reading text messages. I noticed everything now with the sharp focus of someone who finally understood the game being played. Where before I'd been stumbling through our marriage blind and confused, now I watched David with the clinical attention of a scientist studying a fascinating but dangerous specimen. His phone, which had been his constant companion during those weeks after his mysterious disappearance, suddenly seemed to be causing him anxiety. It would ring or chime with notifications, and instead of the pleased anticipation I'd grown accustomed to seeing on his face, David would glance at the screen with what looked almost like dread. One evening, while I was washing dishes and he was supposedly reading the newspaper, his phone rang. The ringtone was different from usual, some generic melody I didn't recognize. David nearly jumped out of his chair to grab it, but when he saw the caller ID, his entire body seemed to deflate. "Aren't you going to answer it?" I asked innocently, not turning around from the sink. "It's just work stuff," he said, but his voice sounded strained. "I'll call them back later." The phone stopped ringing, then immediately started again. Same ringtone, same visible tension in David's shoulders. This time he did answer, but he took the call upstairs, speaking in hushed tones that carried the unmistakable cadence of an argument. When he came back down 20 minutes later, he looked exhausted. There were actual stress lines around his eyes, and his earlier good mood had evaporated completely. "Everything okay?" I asked, maintaining the concerned, supportive tone I'd perfected over the past weeks. "Fine," he snapped, then seemed to catch himself. "Sorry, just work drama. You know how it is." But I could see it wasn't fine. David was starting to unravel, and I hadn't even done anything yet except stop being the anxious, questioning wife he'd grown tired of managing. My newfound calm seemed to be having an effect he hadn't anticipated. The really fascinating part was watching him try to read me. For months, I'd been an open book. Every emotion, every worry, every need visible on my face and in my voice. David had grown accustomed to managing my reactions, to knowing exactly how to dismiss my concerns or redirect my attention. But now, when he looked at me, I could see confusion flickering in his eyes. "You seem different lately," he said one morning over coffee, studying my face carefully. "Happier, more relaxed. I've been reading some self-help books," I told him, which was technically true. Sandra Martinez had recommended several books about divorce strategy and financial protection. Learning to be more independent, more self-sufficient. "I think you're right that I was being too needy." Instead of looking pleased that I'd taken his criticism to heart, David frowned slightly. "What kind of books?" "Oh, just general wellness stuff. Finding happiness within yourself instead of depending on others for validation, that sort of thing." I smiled at him with genuine warmth. "I'm learning to be content with my own company." That seemed to disturb him more than my previous neediness ever had. The David who had wanted space, who had complained about my need for attention, suddenly seemed unsettled by my newfound independence. He'd spent months training me to need less from him, and now that I was giving him exactly what he'd asked for, he looked suspicious. His mysterious humming stopped completely. The secret smiles became rare, replaced by watchful glances and nervous energy. David Morrison, who had been so confident in his double life, was starting to realize that something had shifted in the balance of power. He just couldn't figure out what. I chose our kitchen table for the confrontation. The same maple table where we'd shared thousands of meals, where we'd helped Emma and Tyler with homework, where we'd made plans and shared dreams and built the foundation of what I believed was a solid marriage. If David was going to destroy our life together, it seemed fitting that the destruction should happen in the heart of our home. I waited until Saturday morning when we both had nowhere to be, no work obligations that could serve as escape routes. David was sitting in his usual spot, reading the newspaper and drinking his coffee from Emma's Old World's Best Dad mug, completely oblivious to what was about to unfold. I'd practiced this moment in my mind for days. But as I pulled the manila envelope from the kitchen counter where I'd placed it, my hands remained perfectly steady. 3 weeks of careful preparation had given me something I hadn't felt in months: absolute certainty about what needed to happen next. "David," I said quietly, setting the envelope on the table between us. "We need to talk." He looked up from the sports section, probably expecting another conversation about household repairs or weekend plans. "Sure, honey. What's on your mind?" Instead of answering, I opened the envelope and began laying photographs on the table one by one. David and Sarah at the outdoor cafe. David and Sarah walking hand in hand through Riverside Park. David and Sarah kissing outside what I now knew was their shared apartment. Each image landed on the table with a soft whisper that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. I watched David's face cycle through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, panic, and finally a kind of trapped desperation. His coffee mug froze halfway to his lips, and I could see his mind racing, probably trying to formulate explanations or denials. "I know about Sarah Chun," I said, my voice calm and steady. "I know about the apartment you've been renting together. I know about the secret bank account you opened 10 months ago." I placed the ultrasound photos on top of the other evidence. "I know she's pregnant." David set his mug down with shaking hands. His face had gone completely white, and I could see a thin sheen of perspiration forming on his forehead despite the cool morning air. "Claire, I can explain," he started, but I held up my hand. "I'm not asking for explanations, David. I'm telling you what happens next." The power in that moment was intoxicating. For months, I'd been the one desperately seeking answers, begging for attention, trying to understand why my husband had become a stranger. Now, David was the one off balance, scrambling to regain control of a situation that had already moved far beyond his influence. "Those 2 days you disappeared," I continued. "You weren't in some kind of trouble. You were with her, weren't you? Planning this, planning how you were going to leave me for a woman young enough to be our daughter." "It's not what you think." David tried again, but his voice cracked. "It's exactly what I think. And when you came home with that smile, telling me I'd understand soon, you weren't being loving or mysterious. You were being cruel. You wanted to watch me worry while you finalized the details of abandoning me." David's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. The confident man who had been humming secret songs and checking his phone with pleased anticipation was gone, replaced by someone who looked small and caught and desperately afraid. 28 years, David, 28 years of marriage, and this is how you choose to end it, by making me think I was losing my mind while you planned your escape.
Claire, please.
"I'm not finished," I said, and something in my tone made him close his mouth immediately. "You're going to pack a bag, and you're going to leave this house today. You're going to move in with Sarah permanently, since you've apparently been living there part-time anyway." The woman David had married would have been crying by now, begging him to explain, to fight for their marriage. But that woman was gone. 3 days after David moved out, his whole world collapsed in a way I never could have orchestrated myself. The irony was so perfect, so poetically just, that if I hadn't witnessed it firsthand, I might not have believed it. David had been calling me constantly since Saturday, leaving voicemails that progressed from angry demands to desperate pleas. "Claire, we need to talk about this rationally. You don't understand the whole situation. I made mistakes, but we can work through this." I deleted each message without listening to more than a few seconds. But Tuesday morning brought a call I did answer. David's voice was broken and panicked in a way I'd never heard before. "Claire," he gasped, and I could tell he'd been crying. "Oh, God. Claire, I need help."
She's gone.
"Sarah's gone." Despite everything he'd put me through, the raw desperation in his voice made me pause. "What do you mean gone?" "She cleaned out the apartment, took everything and the bank account. Our bank account. It's empty. She took it all." His voice cracked completely. $68,000.
Claire.
Everything I'd saved for us to start over. I sat down slowly at our kitchen table, the same table where I'd confronted him 3 days earlier. "What about the baby, David?" The silence that followed was so long I thought he might have hung up. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "There was no baby."
What?
"The ultrasound pictures, they weren't real. Sarah, she admitted it before she left. She printed them from some website. She was never pregnant, Claire. It was all fake." The magnitude of the deception was staggering. Sarah hadn't just been David's mistress. She'd been his con artist. While I'd been fighting to save my marriage, while David had been planning to leave me for this young woman and their unborn child, Sarah had been playing a completely different game. She left me a note, David continued, his voice hollow. She said she'd been planning this for months, that she targeted me specifically because I was emotionally vulnerable and financially stable. She knew exactly what she was doing from the very beginning. I found myself thinking about all those secret phone calls that had been causing David stress lately, the way his confidence had been cracking over the past few weeks. Sarah had probably been getting impatient, demanding more money, threatening to expose their affair if he didn't speed up his timeline for leaving me. "There's more," David said, and I could hear him taking shaky breaths. "I called the apartment complex this morning. Sarah Chun was never on the lease. The whole time it was just me. She convinced me to put everything in my name for tax purposes. I'm responsible for 6 more months of rent on a place I can't afford." The woman David had fallen in love with, the woman he'd been willing to destroy our marriage for, had never existed. Sarah had created an elaborate fiction, and David had been so desperate to believe in it that he dismantled his real life to chase a fantasy. "She even had a fake job," David continued, his voice breaking. "The dental office where she claimed to work. They've never heard of her. I don't even know if Sarah Chun is her real name." I thought about those photographs Detective Santos had shown me. David looking so happy, so alive, so in love. He'd been in love, all right, but with a carefully constructed lie. Sarah had studied him, learned what he wanted to hear, what he needed to feel, and she'd given it to him just long enough to drain his bank account and disappear. "Claire," David whispered, "I know I don't deserve to ask, but can you ever forgive me? Is there any way we can fix this?" For the first time in months, I felt something almost like pity for my husband. He'd lost everything, his marriage, his money, his mistress, and his self-respect. All for a woman who'd never been real. But pity wasn't the same as love, and it certainly wasn't the same as trust. Emma called on a Thursday evening, 3 weeks after David's world had imploded. I was sitting in my new apartment, a bright one-bedroom place across town that I'd found and rented using my own credit, my own income, my own name, when her number appeared on my phone. I'd been expecting this call ever since David had started reaching out to the children, trying to rebuild the bridges he'd burned. "Mom." Emma's voice was careful, measured in the way it got when she was trying to navigate family politics. "I talked to Dad today." I sat down the book I'd been reading, a thriller about a woman who disappears and starts a new life, and waited. Emma had always been the peacemaker in our family, the one who tried to smooth over conflicts and find middle ground where none existed. He's pretty broken up about everything," she continued. "He told me what happened with that woman, how she scammed him. Mom, he's living in some awful efficiency apartment near his office. He says he can barely afford groceries." "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, and I meant it. Despite everything David had done to me, I didn't take pleasure in his financial ruin, but I also didn't feel responsible for fixing it. "He wants to talk to you about reconciling," Emma said, her voice gaining urgency. "He knows he made terrible mistakes, but he thinks maybe you two could work through this with counseling, maybe. He says he realizes now that he threw away the best thing in his life for something that wasn't even real." I looked around my apartment, at the books I'd arranged exactly how I wanted them, at the artwork I'd chosen without considering anyone else's preferences, at the small dining table where I ate meals I'd cooked for myself in portions that actually made sense for one person. For the first time in decades, my living space was entirely my own. "What do you think I should do, Emma?" I asked.
I don't know, Mom.
I mean, what he did was horrible. Unforgivable, really. But you two were together for almost 30 years. That has to count for something, doesn't it? And now that he sees how stupid he was. I could hear the hope in my daughter's voice, the desire for our family to somehow magically repair itself and go back to the way things were before. Emma was 24, still young enough to believe that love could conquer all, that good intentions could undo betrayal, that broken trust could be glued back together if everyone just tried hard enough. "He asked me to tell you that he loves you," Emma continued, "that he never stopped loving you, even when he was with her. He says it was like he was living in some kind of fog, making decisions that weren't really him. Your father is a grown man, Emma, I said gently. Every decision he made was his own choice. Sarah didn't hypnotize him or hold a gun to his head. He chose to have an affair. He chose to open secret bank accounts. He chose to plan a divorce without telling me. Those weren't fog-induced mistakes. They were deliberate actions he took over months and months. But, Mom, I'm not angry anymore, I interrupted. And I realized as I said it that it was true. I'm not bitter or vengeful. I actually hope your father finds peace and happiness, but I can't be the one to give those things to him. There was a long pause. You won't even consider it. Won't even talk to him. I thought about the woman I'd been 6 months ago, desperate for David's attention, willing to make herself smaller to earn his love, questioning her own worth when he pulled away. That woman would have jumped at the chance to reconcile, would have seen his suffering as proof that he'd learned his lesson. Tell your father I appreciate the sentiment, I said finally, but I'm not the same woman he left behind. That woman would have taken him back without question, would have been grateful just to have him home. But I'm not her anymore. 6 months later, I sit in my favorite corner of my apartment, a reading nook I've created by the large window that faces east, catching the morning light that streams across my coffee cup and the pages of whatever book has captured my attention that day. It's a Saturday morning in late autumn, and the maple tree outside is dropping its leaves like golden confetti, each one marking another day of the life I've built from the ashes of my marriage. My wedding ring sits in a small ceramic dish on my bookshelf, not hidden away in some drawer where I might forget about it, but visible, present, a daily reminder of the woman I used to be. I kept it not out of sentimentality or some secret hope for reconciliation, but as a talisman of my own strength. That ring represents 28 years of my life, but it also represents the moment I chose to save myself instead of a marriage that was already dead. The apartment is smaller than the house David and I shared, but it's filled with light in a way our old home never was. I've painted the walls colors I love, soft blues and warm yellows that David would have called too bold or impractical. I've hung artwork that speaks to me, bought furniture that fits my body and my needs rather than some imaginary entertaining schedule we rarely fulfilled. Every single item in this space was chosen by me for me without consideration for anyone else's preferences or judgment. The woman who used to wake up at 6:15 every morning to make her husband's coffee exactly the way he liked it feels like a character from a book I read long ago, someone I remember fondly but wouldn't want to be again. These days, I make coffee for myself, exactly how I like it, and I drink it slowly while watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades I never had time to notice when I was busy managing someone else's morning routine. Emma visits once a month, and Tyler calls every Sunday. They've both adjusted to the reality of our divorce better than I expected, though I can still see the occasional wistfulness in Emma's eyes when she talks about before. But they've also noticed changes in me that they seem to appreciate. A confidence, a lightness, a sense of humor that I'd lost somewhere along the way in those final years of my marriage. You seem more like yourself, Mom, Tyler told me during his last call, more like the mom I remember from when I was little. Before Dad got so... He didn't finish the sentence, but I knew what he meant. Before David got so distant, so critical, so focused on what I wasn't rather than what I was. I've learned that sometimes the most devastating betrayal becomes the greatest gift, though it takes time to unwrap it and understand its true value. David didn't just leave me. He freed me to discover who I was when I wasn't trying to be who he needed me to be. Those 2 days he vanished broke my heart, but they also broke the chains I didn't even know I was wearing.